I just didn't have the autonomy that I know I needed in retrospect to thrive. So after a year in, I said, that's it. They were shocked, but I was not, because I was actually, between you and I was miserable because I wasn't enjoying it. I was busy, but for me, the work it wasn't meaningful.
This is the Happen to Your Career podcast with Scott Anthony Barlow.
We help you stop doing work that doesn't fit you, figure out what does, and make it happen.
We help you define the work that is unapologetically you and then go get it.
If you feel like you were meant for more and you're ready to make a change, keep listening.
Here's Scott.
Here's Scott.
Here's Scott.
A big part of what we do here at Happen to Your Career on this podcast in our company is not just to get people to better jobs or enjoy their work more or do work they love or whatever. Instead, it's much more about helping you realize what creates more fulfilling work and ultimately a more fulfilling life. And when we're talking about making an intentional career change, that process is pretty fun, or at least it can be, especially at the beginning. And it also is really challenging. For example, if you're in the situation where you just quit your job after a year because it wasn't a fit, how do you identify opportunities that do, in fact, fit?
Week 1 was fine. Week 2 was fine. Week 3, I'm like, what the heck did you just do to yourself, right? So we're about 4 months in and things got slow. And you start to ask yourself, what are you thinking?
That's Edna. Edna is a scientist who spent 19 years working in consumer packaged goods for the same company. During that time, she moved from role to role around the world in search of more fulfillment. Eventually, she decided her search of fulfillment needed to move beyond her longtime employer, and she moved to a new organization within the same industry. It didn't take her long to realize that new company was not a good fit, and she needed to move to something new, something different. This time around, she decided she wanted to take a more holistic approach and figure out what she truly wanted instead of sticking with the familiar. Edna began working with a coach on our team, and she ultimately moved to a new role as a scientist in pharmaceutical research and development, a completely new industry that she had never considered. In our conversation, you're going to hear all of the details that went into Edna's year-long journey in search of much more fulfilling work. Strengths, she trusted the process, she figured out what would work for her specific situation. She ended up using executive recruiters. By the way, we haven't covered this strategy of using executive recruiters a lot on the Happen to Your Career podcast because for most people, it's actually not a great strategy. Most people think that they're going to go find a headhunter. The headhunter is going to, be a great way to introduce them to new people. And generally, you find that that's not useful if you're looking for fulfilling work. But there is a way to do it. And for some situations, it's fantastic. You're going to get to hear that strategy as you listen to my and Edna's conversation. Let's dive in. Here's Edna sharing a bit about her career journey up to this point.
I worked for a consumer packaged goods company, CPG company, for 19 years. As you mentioned, I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD in chemistry, and I was literally hired out of a lab. I was doing my postdoc, and the company came on campus to recruit, and I interviewed. I got the job. And I honestly say I had an awesome time because in retrospect, I changed jobs every 3 to 4 years on the most part. And I changed jobs into something that was different enough, challenging enough to allow me to learn and grow. So for example, I started out, my first job was formulating laundry detergents, and I did that for 4 years. And then I moved on to formulating cleansing liquids, your body washes, your liquid hand soap. And I did that for 3 years, just getting bored out of my mind. I moved to formulating antiperspirants. And all of this was in North America. And then I got the opportunity to move to Mexico and lead a team that was based there, formulating our household surface cleaners. So toilet roll cleaners, kitchen degreasers. I did that for 3 years. And so you get the sense. I had the opportunity to work on a lot of different product types for a lot of different geographies with a lot of different teams, with a lot of different stakeholders in the US, in Mexico, and ultimately in India. So even though I was with the same company for 19 years, I felt every time you make one of these changes, it's a big enough switch that it stretches you. And what I've learned through the process with Ben and the reflection of myself is learning and growth is important to me.
Mm. It sounds like that is something that you've arrived at as you made different moves through your early career. Tell me about that.
Yeah. And it is. I mean, the minute I used to tell my bosses that, well, maybe I just used to reflect on it. The minute I can do my job on autopilot, it's not good for me. It's not good for the company. It's not good for anybody around me. So I need to feel stretched and challenged to be at my best. I just love to learn. I love to learn, and it's great and it's frustrating sometimes because it does result, at least in my career, has resulted in these multiple changes, right? And not small changes, moving to Mexico, coming back to the US, moving to India. And ultimately, actually, why I left my first company was because as I projected my career, another decade, the opportunities to continue to learn and grow at the magnitude that I wanted were not there from what I could see, right? So yes, there's a bigger job, more money, but is it stretch enough for me? I wasn't sure. So I actually wasn't actively looking for a career move at that time. And I was based in India. I was leading the R&D organization that's based in India for my company there. And so they found me, my second company found me. And when they reached out, I said, listen, I was curious why they reached out to me because I'm like, I don't do what you do. They said, let's talk. I said, where would I go? They said, where do you want to go? What did I do? They said, what do you want to do? We're hiring you. We'll find a place for you in the organization. And so after 6 months, we talked and I decided to join. And so came back to the US, leading a team that was based here, big company, leading its industry. And what I discovered is company was good. It was not a fit for me. And this is coming into the values as well, right? I, in retrospect, realized that I thrive when I have autonomy. So, and I didn't realize that the 19 years of my previous company, I had a lot more autonomy than I felt I had in this new environment. I was extremely busy. Again, it was a growing industry. The company was doing awesome, but I just didn't have the autonomy that I know I needed in retrospect to thrive. So after a year in, I said, that's it. They were shocked, but I was not, because I was actually, between you and I was miserable because I wasn't enjoying it. I was busy, but for me, the work it wasn't meaningful. I was doing a lot of work. For my taste, it wasn't meaningful. So I quit, and I quit Scott without a job in hand. I was done. So I quit. I didn't realize how tired I was. I slept for 2 months. I traveled a bit, and then I found a coach. And part of finding the coach is I needed some help. Yes, recruiters were calling me even then, but I wasn't ready to have the conversation with them because I didn't want to make the same mistakes I had made in the first transition, in the second transition. Second thing is I wanted to make sure I was looking more holistically at opportunities versus just going into an industry, similar industry that I had known before. I could have ended up there, but I wanted to make sure that I was looking more holistically at opportunities. And third, I wanted some structure, right? Because you go from, as you said, going to stop, and it's a little bit jarring to the system when you used to some sort of structure to absolutely none. So I wanted some sort of structure and guidance to help me navigate through this, right? So, and someone to be accountable. Otherwise, I could also sleep my life away, right? So that is how I found you, is really looking for that holistic. I want to make sure I'm not just going to what I know, I'm comfortable with. I needed the structure and I needed accountability. For me, I'm trusting that even though my coach could not tell me when I get the job, what or how I get the job, trusting enough in the process, because that's what your team is designed to do, is trusting enough in the process to get me there, to get me to the end point, the outcome that I desire, but not knowing exactly, putting the trust in, these guys got it. This is what they do for a living. You do your piece, it'll work out. So I think it is, but other than that, I don't know. I don't know that I really thought about it from the fact that I'm a scientist. Maybe it's just because I'm a scientist, so I just approach things in a certain way that I don't even think about it. But yeah,
it's like, obviously, is there any other way to do it?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so here's another thing that I was really interested in. I think you did a phenomenal job when you were going through and identifying and taking feedback and inputs for your strengths.
I love that.
I could tell. And here's one of the things we don't actually talk about this a lot on the podcast, but internally, we understand that our clients are ready to move on to the next milestone, if you will, if you want to call this a milestone, once they've taken ownership over their strengths. And when we talk about ownership, that is partially in the verbiage and how they're able to externalize those. But there's a couple other elements too where we consider ownership. However, one of the fun things about that is it shows up in very different ways from person to person. Not a surprise, we're all different people. And I think one of the things that you did that was really fun and fascinating was you took all of these different inputs. And just for a little bit of context for everybody listening, one of the things we'll often do with many of the folks that we work with is we'll ask them, in this case, you, Edna, to collect inputs from other people who know you, who've worked with you, or friends or family members, in terms of what they believe that you're great at. What are your strengths? What do they see that is great about you? And sometimes people are apprehensive about this process, but it always ends up with like all these really wonderful things about the individual. And I think what was fun about what you did is you color coded every single piece of feedback, whether it came from an assessment, whether it came from a person, whether it didn't matter what the source was, but you had all of these different types of inputs. And then you said, okay, well, here's where I see my strengths. And then you took that and color coded so you could visually see where and how they showed up in the feedback. What prompted you to do that in the first place? And I'm curious what you learned from that.
Yeah, so I'm visual, clearly. And so the colors for me helped. And the Gallup Strengths Finder already had that sort of their color code. So I took that color code and sort of matched it with I matched my feedback with the Gallup Strength. And it was interesting because I was also a little bit apprehensive about getting feedback because you've done enough assessments at this point in my career. But I took a step back and said, hey, this is from a different lens. And I like that the questions that you reach out to folks with are all positive, right? So I took the opportunity to seek feedback from people that have managed me, people who I've managed, people who've been my peers or my stakeholders. And I did it from the US, India, and China, the scientists. So this is the scientists coming out. You want data that's representative.
Let's get a significant sample size. Let's representative data. Let's get all
from every level. I don't want it to be biased. So I guess there is some scientists in it, right? A lot of scientists. And it was and then you've done the Strengths Finder assessment, and I got my top 5 strengths. It was so fascinating to see when the feedback came that my strengths are my strengths. They were saying exactly what Gallup Strengths Finder was saying in different words. They express it in their Mexican way, in their American way, or in their Indian way. But what they were saying about me is me. So I'm very consistent and very reassuring to know that who I am and how I show up in the workplace has value. One of the questions I asked is, what seems to come easy for me that others struggle with? What do you think I could teach others? And the consistency that came out of that feedback for me just solidified that understanding and appreciation of my strengths. And also in some level, helped me not to minimize, because you see individualization is my number one. I'm like, it's just what I do. No, but it has value. And it was so clear to me from the feedback I got from people around the world that it has value. And for me, and I'd actually done Strength Finder before, and I
Yeah.
said, "Do I need to do this again?" And they said, "Yeah, you do need to do it again." What I found for me in retrospect is this exercise really anchored the process. It's because you have to start by understanding what it is you're good at, where that comes from, and you'll then be able to appreciate, hopefully for the individuals listening, is the successes you've had and the contribution that is in your career and the contribution that your strengths have had towards that success. Because I bet you they're rooted in your strengths. The successes you've had are rooted in your strengths. But until you're able to sort of step and see that link, you may not fully appreciate it. So for me, one of the great things about this whole process is I walk away with a deeper understanding and appreciation of my strengths. And the process is rooted. It starts there. It starts with understanding your strengths, which is, again, so basic. I've done this before, but I hadn't never done it like this. Never done it like this. And I said appreciation and the choice to leverage my strengths even more in the future. So not only do I walk away with the appreciation and understanding, there is a very deliberate decision and intention to leverage these moving forward, because that's more success will come out of that.
Yeah. And to your point, the first step really is that awareness, which creates that foundation or grounding that you had mentioned earlier. If everything else decision-wise to come later is going to be grounded. If you want to do more work in your strengths, you have to understand your strengths at an incredible depth. Otherwise, how likely is it going to be that you're going to choose to do work or spend more time in your strengths? It's highly unlikely, right? Of course.
Yeah.
So really great point. So here's my question for you. When you think about that and you got that grounding, how did that help you functionally later? When we fast forward ahead and we say, okay, now you got this really wonderful opportunity that I think is a great fit for you from everything that I understand and everything that Ben and I have talked about. But I'm curious, how did you see that functionally show up along the way? That being your strengths understanding.
For me, I think it helped. It helps me on a day-to-day. So I actually understand myself better. Sometimes when I'm in situations and I'm struggling a bit, it helps certain things. I'm like, I can understand why this is off for me because I'm missing X, Y, Z. And for example, I'm an achiever, right? And there's sometimes I like to procrastinate. And I've discovered just put it on a list. If I put it on a list, it's gonna get done because the achiever in me will ensure that thing is checked off the list, right?
It shall be
so
checked.
Little tricks like that,
Yes.
Exactly. The little tricks like that. I think the biggest one for me, though, is leaning into my individualization during the process, and I'm sure it'll show up on the job, as I've taken up this new role, but. Because what I discovered, and I'm going to fast forward to the experimentation phase, there was a lot of emphasis in the experimentation modules around making sure you're connecting with whomever you're reaching out to. So if you're reaching out via email or if you're reaching out via phone, make sure you understand who it is you're talking to, try to spend some time connecting. And honestly, I struggled with that a bit because I'm here to get some information. I don't have time to connect. What I realized is because of my individualization, I'm inherently curious about people. And what I realized is to the extent that you can connect, it impacts the transaction. Every interaction has a transaction and a connection. The quality of your connection can impact your transaction. So for me, just focusing on trying to, and I'll step back, I'll give you an example of even going into interviews. In the past, I would want to get through the interview, and interviewing usually comes quite naturally for me. But I'll be so focused on the interview, and as a result of going through this process, it shifted a bit. I go in and try to understand who's on the other side of the interview. Who is this person who's talking to me? So have the conversation. The interview will happen. We know we're both here for an interview. None of us is going to forget to get that part in. But spending the time up front to connect was a shift for me, and seeing how that connection then in turn impacts how the interview happens.
Hmm.
And I've done it, yes, within the interviewing space, but even outside, you go to a restaurant and you're waiting for a table and you're talking to the hostess. In the past, I wouldn't really bother two state party of two waiting. But now you have hey, it looks like you're busy today. How's the house? Just spend a minute connecting, because that connection oftentimes impacts then the transaction. The tables come up earlier. Would you be willing to? It's just little things. And recognizing that because I'm inherently wired to connect with people, connect with people. So that somehow an individualization is my number one. So I would do it anyway, but being mindful of that. One, it's a strength. Two, it's not work for me. And people are people. On the other side of any interaction is a person, and that person, try to get to know that person a little bit. You may have hours, you may have seconds. Spend a second to connect.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So what I hear you saying is that you realized somewhere along the way about how important it is to make that connection and to connect with others. And then it also sounds like along the way, you realized that your tendencies or strengths, or it doesn't matter what they are, whatever we'd like to call these, your tendency to be individualistic or to individualize, and then also that paired with your curiosity, those make a way that is easy for you to connect with others. Mm-hmm. So I love that example because it is you very literally harnessing your strengths and tendencies and utilizing them in a different way than what you were thinking about it before. Mm-hmm. That's cool. Love
it. Exactly. And because I end up knowing a lot about people anyway. Because in retrospect, individualization is my number one. And so from the taxi driver in Mexico City who showed me pictures of his vacation, and so, but just being mindful that that you can lean into that. And I have the choice as to how much I lean into it or not. But being mindful, top of mind, that listen, spend the time, if you can, spend the time to connect, because that connection usually the quality of that connection impacts the transaction. Yeah.
Edna, tell me a little bit about the role that you're moving into and what makes it a great fit for you.
Yeah. So I'm changing segment slightly. And I remember in the beginning, I said I wanted to be able to look more holistically. I would never have picked this segment for myself.
Interesting.
Yeah. Which is, and what makes it a great fit is that it's an innovation. So I'm staying within research and development, which is what I love. I love working with scientists or within the science space. I am going to lead innovation. Woo-hoo. This is what I love to do. I love to lead innovation. Because, as I said, one of my values is learning and growth. And the beauty about innovation is that you're not doing exactly the same thing repetitively. You're constantly pushing and learning and trying it something differently or doing something totally different altogether. In addition to that, what I love about this opportunity is that the company as a whole is pivoting from one that wasn't necessarily innovation focused to one that wants to be a lot more innovative in the future.
So time and place is an important part of this for you too.
As well. They don't know how to do it quite, hence people like me coming in. I don't know them, I don't know their segment, so we're gonna have to figure it out, but they're open. So what makes it beautiful is, yes, it's innovation, it's in R&D. The organization is pivoting. And so having the opportunity to help shape what this organization will look like in future is music to my ears. This is what I do. This is when I'm in my sweet spot. And in a meeting, in an organization that does meaningful work. So it's in healthcare, about affordable healthcare. Never done it, so gotta learn. Opportunity to learn for me is huge. Again, learning and growth is important to me.
Yes.
And in a space doing stuff, the type of stuff that I love to do. It'll be a challenge, lot to learn, lot to figure out. But for me, I feel like it's the role that was created for me at a time when in a company that's at the right spot and it's open. open to be changed, open to be influenced, open to be shaped. And I'm looking forward to that.
That's fun. That's a lot of fun. That right type of challenge in the right environment.
In the right environment.
Yeah, tends to create really enjoyable and healthy growth.
And everybody I talk to it just feels like interviewed with this, just feels like it's the type, it's my tribe. One of the things I told Ben along the way when in the coaching journey is that I need to find, I forgot I said it. He said, you used to tell me you need to find your tribe. I need to find my tribe. When you're talking to them, I'm like, this is my tribe. These are my people. These are they approach leadership and the same way that I do. This is my tribe. So very much looking forward to having the autonomy to drive, lead, shape the future of an organization that's working in a very meaningful space for me. That's changing.
That's cool. That's amazing. I appreciate that we got to sit front row while you were working on this. This is amazing.
Yeah. Highs, lows, on good, bad, ugly, right?
Yes.
We got through it. It was awesome in retrospect.
Can we talk about for a moment something that we have not mentioned regularly on the Happen to Your Career podcast? Tactically, one of the approaches that led you to this particular role, this particular job opportunity, was working through recruiters. And you, before we hit the record button, astutely acknowledged that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about that on the Happen to Your Career podcast. And there's a good reason for that. That's really not a great approach for everyone, but it can be a good approach for some people. And I think it certainly has worked well for you. Can you tell me a little bit about how you worked with recruiters and how you worked through to figure out that certain opportunities were right for you or not right for you as you were working through recruiting relationships?
And so it was interesting. I quit my job, and I quit on a Friday. Well, I quit. My last day was on Friday. I quit actually on a Monday. I had recruiters calling me immediately. I was in no shape or form to have discussions with recruiters, and in me, that self-assurance said, don't just jump in. I just, you have to make sure this next thing is right for me. In my case, I never reached out to the executive recruiters. The executive recruiters reached out to me. And I think what worked for me is a couple of things. Again, the sense of knowing what I was looking for, having gone through the process, right? Understanding the strengths, understanding your values. So I had clarity around what I was looking for. And second is because experimentation came into play for me then, was doing the research on the organizations and the potential companies to try to get a feel for, is this the type of culture I'd want to work with?
Yes.
So there's a lot of good tools and a lot of tips and tricks that I learned through Ben into how to do that research on organizations. And then third is just, I would come back to my self-assurance. You talk to the recruiter, I'm like, this one's, even though the job may sound good, this one's just not for me. I can't tell, it comes from my self-assurance. I don't know where it's inherently in me. Some things are just like, it's not for me. It's not for me. So even when this opportunity came, initially I was like, what? Doing what? Where? Why would that? But I was like, okay, let's have the conversation. I hadn't thought about this segment, hadn't thought about relocating, actually didn't want to relocate, but let's talk. And once you get into a conversation, then you realize actually, maybe. And then the next conversation is like, even more so. So I think just using the recruiters not as a channel that directed opportunities to me versus a decision making. I still have the opportunity to decide, but the recruiters were the ones in my case that channeled opportunities to me. And then I did use the experimental tools, some of the experimental tools to do the research in the company and the culture and the people. Who do I know within that? Can I reach out to from that company that I might know to get additional information? So I still did that work.
Yeah.
But the recruiters just funneled the opportunities to me. I use them that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that
I'm not getting swayed necessarily by the recruiters, except there was one.
There was one
who actually, and that's like, this opportunity is not for me. So we had the conversation, and I was telling them how I quit my last job, and he's like, "Oh, you cannot say this. You cannot say this when you interview." And I'm like, "Why not?" So he almost treated me as if I was damaged goods, and I was like, "I'm not damaged goods. Listen, I learned. I went through this. This was my journey. Here's what I learned." So yeah, there was one recruiter like, no,
there were all the telltale signs. And
not this job, not this opportunity. Yeah. So it's just I leverage them to channel opportunities to me, and then I still went through the process of assessment, evaluation, but they ultimately was my call.
So here's the things I think that in listening to your story made that work as a strategy for you. Number one, you had already gone through the process of understanding what you were looking for, the most important elements, pieces that lined up with your strengths, how you wanted to work, what you're interested in, what creates the right magnitude was the word you used of growth for you, which I love that. I haven't had anybody else use the word magnitude of growth. I've been looking for a good word around that. So I'm going to borrow that. That's amazing. And so you'd already done all of the hard work going into this to be able to recognize what would or would not be a fit. And then as opposed to saying, hey, recruiters are my end all be all, you were strictly using this as a channel to get visibility to different types of opportunities that may line up. Now, this is not a great situation for everybody because some people it strategically works depending on what you're looking for and does that line up with some of the experiences that you have. And for other people, it doesn't necessarily when you're making a career change. In this case, what I love about it for you is that you were talking to lots of recruiters and lots of opportunities, which as a function, if you get like the recruiter who messages you, and I think you'd be amazing, you go all the way through the process, you have one job offer and you've talked to exactly one to two recruiters, then all of a sudden it's really difficult to say no to that opportunity for many people, self-assurance or otherwise. But what you did, you talked to many, many people over the course of time. And then that helps create a better decision-making framework too. Nicely done.
Absolutely. And it also gives you confidence that even if you say no to this executive recruiter, there's going to be another one come, right? I can't tell you where actually I just had two recruiters for two different opportunities. I've diverted them to friends, but reach out to me in the past week. So you don't get so desperate that this is the only one. The first ones, and you say if you turn them down, you can get a little nervous. But if you're in it long enough, you realize if you have something of value to offer, they'll show up. They'll show up. So just having the confidence that they'll show up, and then having the coach to help you as well when you're not sure, thinking it doesn't feel quite right. And I remember Ben saying, "What do you think? What do you feel?" I'm like, I don't think so. He said, "Go with what you feel." And so, okay. We're really excited. And what I also loved about this approach is you never knew what opportunities they were coming at with. They came from, or I would never have picked this industry for myself, for example, the one that I said yes to. So it did, in a sense, also open me up to opportunities and segments and geographies that I would never have considered. I had an opportunity in Switzerland, another one in the UK, and another one lots across the US. And so I would never have, but it had a diversity of opportunities come to me that I perhaps would never even have found had I gone about the approach the way I was going about the approach.
I think there's one other really important note on that it sounds like you're pointing out, that this became a source of exposure to new opportunities for you. And I think in your situation, it worked really incredibly well It doesn't always work for every single person under the sun as a strategy. And it depends on what you want and the life that you want to build. In your case, I think that this was an incredibly effective strategy because it allowed you to not really sit back necessarily, but allow opportunities to come to you. And then you could evaluate those opportunities and say, wow, I've never heard of this. Let's investigate that. And then that allowed you to not just gain exposure, but experiment in a very different way. A lot of times we talk about experimentation where you're seeking those opportunities out, and then you are getting some measure of feedback, and then that influences your understanding of what it is that you want. In this case, I love the strategic nature of this because it was, hey, let's attract some of these to me, and then let's evaluate them, and let's still use these as experimentation. Yes. Yeah. Nicely done.
So it was experimentation, but a little bit, it was differently. And it was funny because I told Ben, I said, when we got to that stage and I started doing experimentation as it was initially designed, and I said, it's gonna look different for me. It's gonna look different for me. And so I experimented, but it was different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What advice would you give to other people who are interested in making a career change? I mean, we're talking about like these ups and downs and all kinds of things spread over many months. So this is not exactly a small excursion. When we're talking about the goal of doing work in a much more fulfilling way, often what I mentioned earlier is intentional career change. This can tend to be fun at periods of time, but it can also be really challenging. So what advice would you give to people who are considering making an intentional career change?
So I tell them to do what I did, in a sense, is you need help. Make sure you try to get someone who has experience in providing guidance to help you through it. 2, I think for me, was to ensure that your network and or the people who surround you are supportive. Because that's another thing that happened during that ambiguous time, is I happened to mention my decision to step away to someone who didn't understand what I'd done. And so had a bunch of questions of why would you do that? Never have done. So that didn't help. I was already in that period of ambiguity. And I realized that, up till that point, I'd surrounded myself with people who were 100% supportive. And even if they were like, okay, now we get you, we're with you, challenging, but we're with you. So because the last thing you need is people who will make you question yourself on this journey that is challenging in and of itself. So lean in, get someone to help, make sure you have the support, and dedicate the time, do the work, and trust the process, even when it feels like, you are questioning why you do it. Trust the process. In my case, just trusting the process. Trust the process. It worked for me.
Most of the episodes you've heard on Happen to Your Career showcase stories of people that have taken the steps to identify and land careers that they are absolutely enamored with, that match their strengths and are really what they want in their lives. If that's something that you're ready to begin taking steps towards, that's awesome. And we want to figure out how we can help. So here's what I would suggest. Take the next 5 seconds to open up your email app and email me directly. I'm going to give you my personal email address, scott@happentoyourcareer.com. Just email me and put conversation in the subject line. And when you do that, I'll introduce you to someone on our team who can have a super informal conversation with, and we'll figure out the very best type of help for you, whatever that looks like, and the very best way that we can support you to make it happen. So send me an email right now with conversation in the subject line. Here's a sneak peek into what we have coming up in store for you next week.
There's a normal distribution of extroverts and introverts among supercommunicators. There's a normal distribution of charming and curmudgeonly. And if you ask supercommunicators, were you always good at communication? Is this something you were born with? Inevitably, they say no.
If you want to get anything done, results of any kind, you're going to need to be able to communicate with other people. And if you really want to excel at just about anything career related, working with a team, making meaningful connections, job interviews, salary negotiation, networking, and quite frankly, anything else that you might be interested in being successful at, well, then it helps if you are a skilled communicator, or what our guest today calls a super communicator. All that and plenty more next week right here on Happen to Your Career. Make sure that you don't miss it. And if you haven't already, click subscribe on your podcast player so that you can download this podcast in your sleep and you get it automatically, even the bonus episodes every single week, sometimes multiple times a week. Until next week, adios. I'm out.